he was basically looking at the vascular system as sort of the energy constraint on the body that had certain consequences. And so we in our discussions were also about that, whether that analogy, which was specific and had a scaling law associated with it, actually applied to cities. So when you actually look at it and start looking at the properties of cities, which is actually the work of doing the science, right? Then what we started concluding was that actually cities had different properties than, say, organisms. So one of the things that is consequential, just to go back to the various networks and parts, is the following. In organisms or vascular systems, another analogy was actually river networks. You kind of imagine sort of the vascular system of a river in a landscape. They're understood as systems of flow that reach every point, so every cell in the body, every bit on land, but that also are essentially trying to be efficient from the point of view of energy. So they're trying to spend as little energy as possible. And that already was a little suspicious in a city, because cities are kind of very energy intense. And what happens to those systems is that they're kind of centralized. So, for example, in your body, every cell kind of is connected to the network, but then the blood flow, say, goes all the way, is collected, goes all the way through the heart and then lungs, and then comes back to each cell. So in some sense, if you were a city, in order to talk to your neighbor, you'd have to go, if it's New York, you have to go through Times Square, right? Which is kind of crazy when you say that. So in a city, the network actually looks similar, but works differently. So the network allows all kinds of local interactions to happen. Like you can go and visit your neighbor without having to go through a more central part of the city and so on. And so the network is so-called decentralized. And this means because the network studied in biology had been analyzed for the least energy dissipation possible. That means that the networks of cities, from this point of how they function, are not using the minimal energy necessary. So that was already like interesting. And so the consequence is that they're doing something different. So in an organism, each cell doesn't need to talk to each cell. The brain is actually an exception. It's a little different, but in most cases, the cells interact just globally through blood flow and hormones and so on. Whereas in a city, the whole point is that a person has agency, unique agency, and can talk to other people and create their own associations and firms and friendships and so on. And so that is essentially the nature of the city, are social interactions between people that can be differentiated, and that then essentially leads to the dynamics of cities as a place where these interactions can be expressed in many ways, economically, politically, other social mechanisms and so on. So that's the big difference, is that cities are much more decentralized. People have agency, and the connections are mostly local, though they go across scales, of course. And that means that cities are not really optimized like biological organisms to save energy and to be efficient. They actually are quite energy intensive, but they create all the products of socioeconomic interactions, which is what's special about